Hello and welcome to another Pipe of Pearl. Today we're going to look at the Hallpike test and vertigo exercises. Before we kick into the actual tests and exercises themselves, we'll just do a quick review on the actual vestibular itself, and in particular we're going to look at those semicircular canals. So obviously when we talk about the semicircular canals, it forms part of the vestibular-cochlear organ that you find inside the ear, and that has a connection to the vestibular-cochlear nerve, which is the 8th cranial nerve. Now the semicircular canals are responsible for controlling or managing dynamic equilibrium, whereas the macule, which is the part in between the cochlear and the semicircular canals, that takes care of our static, basically the movement of our head. The semicircular canals, there's 3 of them, and they are defined as your anterior, posterior, and horizontal. Now, each one of these canals are a tube filled with endolymph, and they have a special area right at the base called the cristae. And the cristae itself contains cilia, basically small hair fibers that when activated by the endolymph will create an action potential which sends that message through the vestibular-cochlear nerve to the brain, multiple centers in the brain, in order to be processed and to tell us where we are in space. So as we are spinning around and going through dynamic movements, our semicircular canals, or collectively known as the labyrinth, take care of the interpretation of our position. Now obviously through massive amounts of movements like a roller coaster, or constantly spinning, or really high dynamic movements like that, this messaging can be overstimulated or hyperpolarized, which gives us that feeling of dizziness, which takes time for the endolymph itself to stop circulating around and stop activating the hair follicles, stop sending the messages in order to regulate ourselves. In the case of vertigo, what happens is quite often in BPPV anyway, is we have a form of crystallized or blockages within the semicircular canals, and that either stops or creates an increase in pressure on those cristae, which means we don't need the dynamic movement in order to generate the movement of the hair. So we could just be standing completely still, but we get this sensation that we are moving. So the test that we're going to go through today is a way of exploiting this by taking the body through dynamic movements that are normal and what an unaffected body could handle, no problems at all, but a person who suffers from this particular pathology of BPPV would get increased vertigo and in turn increase nystagmus. So let's have a quick look at nystagmus, because nystagmus itself is a massive broad terms. It's actually defined as a normal state, especially in children, and then we have our pathological state. So nystagmus itself is a rhythmic, individual, rapid eye movement, which may be slow, fast, or a combination of both. It can be continuous, paroxysmal, with positional. It can be affected by gaze, or it can be affected by head positions itself. These movements can, in fact, reduce vision, especially depth perception. They can also affect balance and coordination. Often when we talk about nystagmus, it can be seen as a transient pathology or an indication of an underlying pathological state. And when we look at clinical nystagmus as opposed to general nystagmus, the major concerns with the finding of nystagmus is trying to localize what abnormality is actually happening, because it can be the brain, it can be the ear, the vestibular itself. There can be a number of different pathways to try to understand this etiology. And when you really deep dive into nystagmus itself, you'll find a huge list of different nystagmus. Now, our job in the early stages is not to diagnose the type of nystagmus. They have specialists that will actually track eye movement through patterns, through different tests, in order to really pinpoint down what type of nystagmus it is. So for us, we are just looking for generalized nystagmus, like our horizontal, our vertical, or our peduncular, which basically means it spins on its space. At least it appears to spin on its space. Nystagmus can be misdiagnosed or misunderstood with another condition known as ocular gyrocrisis. The main difference between ocular gyrocrisis and nystagmus is nystagmus has a rhythm to it. So if it horizontally bounces, it seems to have a rhythm, whereas ocular gyrocrisis doesn't. And it also doesn't have a slow phase in the eye movement itself. As we know, ocular gyrocrisis is generally indicated with certain antiemetics like metoclopramide, prochlorperazine, but the side effects are still quite rare. When we're looking for nystagmus in vertigo, the type of nystagmus that we're actually going to find is known as trigger nystagmus. And in Hallpike tests, we are actually looking for benign proximal positioning nystagmus, which works out really well because it's used to diagnose benign proximal positioning vertigo itself. So when we decide to do a Hallpike test, we want to have an indication that the disorder and the type of vertigo is in fact BPPV. So the main indicators for BPPV, as opposed to other types of vertigo, is the fact that it is transient and it is brought on by head movements, and the vertigo lasts for less than 60 seconds. Now for this test, it's actually indicated that if the vertigo lasts for longer than 60 seconds, then you don't actually do this test. Okay, you're going down a different line of a different type of vertigo. So that can be a good rule of thumb. So look for brought on by head movement and lasts for less than 60 seconds itself. Now the test is pretty simple to do. You have the patient sitting up on a bed. Now it has to be off the ground. You can't do it sitting on the ground because the head has to go below the horizontal plane in order to work. Now if you're in the field, you can manipulate this a little bit by sticking something like webbing underneath where the shoulders will go. So as you lay the patient down, they'll have a place for that head to go, that 30 degrees below that point. You can also do it at the end of a vehicle stretcher, things like that. But what you want to do is you want to get the patient sitting up, and you want to ensure that the patient hasn't actually had any recent head or neck trauma or illnesses themselves. Okay, that's just a general rule of thumb. But you explain to the patient what you're going to do, and then you go through the process. So the idea is you want to adjust the position, so when the patient lies down, the head will be hanging over the bed or whatever you've just set up. Position yourself to a side, left or right, your choice, of the patient, and then you manually turn the patient's head 45 degrees to the side towards you. If the patient has indicated that when I put pressure on my right side, then it's best to start with the right side. So then you're more likely you only have to do the test once. Okay, so once the head is in the position of the 45 degrees, you support the head and the neck, and you move the patient from the sitting position to the supine position with one brisk but smooth motion. So it's not like a suplex where you throw them down, but you guide them down in a smooth but brisk motion, ensuring their head hangs over the back of the actual bed. Ask the patient to keep their eyes open for the whole time, and then you look at their eyes for at least 30 seconds. At least 30 seconds, and you look for nystagmus. Now, what type of nystagmus you see, it doesn't really matter, but generally it's a peduncular or horizontal that you will find in this case, but you look for any type of nystagmus. If you don't get any nystagmus on the right side, then you set them up and you test the left side. If you do get it on the right side, then that's it, test is over, and then you can have a diagnosis for BPPV. If it's negative on both sides, then you start thinking that it could be something else. Now, the typical findings that you'll find for a positive for this BPPV, the nystagmus will start anywhere between 2 and 20 seconds after the actual test is performed. So once they're in that down position, and then you're looking for what I mentioned, the rotational or horizontal nystagmus. If you find vertical, it's still a positive test. Okay, it's just not as likely. Now, this nystagmus will generally last for the 20 to 40 seconds. And if you get that, then it's a positive test. Now, note that if you do the test and then you hand it over to someone else who wants to do the test, who hands it over to someone else, and it just keeps going on in the typical regime that people do because they don't trust anyone else's test, is you'll actually get a reduction in the amount and the magnitude of this nystagmus each time you do the Hallpike test. Okay, now obviously there's a limit if you do it consecutive days, it's obviously going to be the same. But if it's within a similar time period, it will actually be a reduced sign. So just keep that in mind. And it can be one of your deciding factors that if the MO is going to trust your findings, great. If they're not, you can get them back to the MO, then sometimes it's best to actually just let the MO do the Hallpike tests themselves, knowing that they're going to get the optimal results when they do it. From the Hallpike test, if it's positive, we can move on to the Epley maneuvers themselves. Now, these are only done with permission, and they're only done with a positive Hallpike test. So they can be performed after the Hallpike test. So you get a positive, so they're already down in the Hallpike position, which you'll see with C in the picture, or they can be done from the start, especially if you are doing it repeatedly, 2 to 3 times, then you'll start from A, basically. Now, the idea of the Epley maneuvers is, firstly, they typically follow the Hallpike test, and from that position, the head is turned 90 degrees to the other side. So basically, you go from 45 degrees looking over the right shoulder to 45 degrees looking over the left shoulder. And you keep them in that position for 30 seconds. Then whilst maintaining that position, you ask the patient to get up on their shoulder, and then you turn their head a little bit further, so then they are looking down. And you hold that position for 30 seconds as well. Okay? And then you sit them up. Now this can actually realign their semicircular canals, and it can help dislodge those crystals that are forming within it, and it actually has a pretty good success rate as well. Now this process can be repeated 2 or 3 times until the vertigo itself stops or pretty much reduces to a manageable point, but it is dependent on how much the patient can tolerate. Now, the Epley maneuver, depending on the disorder that the person is dealing with, if it is just simple crystals or debris found in the semicircular canals that can be moved on, then it actually can have up to a 90% success rate. Generally speaking, it's 50 to 90% success rate, but with repeated use and exercises, you can actually have a 100% success rate for treating vertigo, BPPV in particular, with these maneuvers themselves. Okay, so that's the Epley maneuvers, which is done after a positive Hallpike test. From there, we have a series of take-home exercises, and this is where a physio can come into play because they can often specialize in vestibular conditions, which can give you a whole array of different exercises that they can tap into that they can do at home. But generally speaking, we have what's known as a modified Epley maneuver, which is denoted by the picture on the left, which is basically a person lying in their bed with a pillow under their shoulders so their head drops below. They turn their head to the left or right, lie down, swap the position over, completely roll over, and then sit up. So basically doing the Epley maneuver in the absence of an actual clinician. They're just mimicking that at home in a bed with the pillow. Okay. The other one on the right is what's known as a Brannett's maneuver. Now, of these two, studies have found that the modified Epley maneuver is slightly better for maintaining BPPV, but the Brannett's is the next best choice. However, from there, there's a whole series of vestibular exercises that the patient can go through that goes through the movements like these ones. It can be performed in a chair. It can be performed standing. You can also do a gazed exercise where you basically look at a point as you rotate your head around in your eyes in a fixed position to put pressure on those areas. So there's a huge collection of different exercises that the patient can move into. And what I've just shown you is the typical exercises that are done for a positive BPPV diagnosis. Okay, so that goes through the Hallpike maneuver itself and the vertigo exercises that you can do. From here, it is highly recommended that you tee up with a GP or a physio that does these maneuvers, and they can take you through a practical demonstration of them. And you can practice these maneuvers on people that don't really have vertigo and don't really need them first, in order to get that feel, understand the patient's weight as you move them through it, to be better prepared if you ever have to do it yourself. But until next time, take care.